Welcome to Stories Untold, a podcast about immigrant entrepreneurs, the businesses they've built, and the challenges they've faced along the way. I'm your host, Sharzad.
And this is Panis. Each week, we sit down with entrepreneurs from different backgrounds and talk about how they build their companies from ideation to execution. Our goal is to inspire, empower, and help you take your idea to the next stage.
Hey guys, it's Panis. Wanted to take the time to thank you all for reaching out to us and letting us know how much you're enjoying our show so far. We need your help. We are planning on expanding our audience and reaching more listeners, which means we need more reviews from you. Do us a quick favor and write your feedback in a review format so we can get featured on the homepage of iTunes and reach more listeners. So let's talk about this week's guest and what we discuss with them on the show. Sharzad and I have been thinking about inviting this week's guest on the show pretty much since we started the Stories Untold series. And we're so excited that we finally got connected and got a chance to interview him just last week. Our guest this week is Mohammed Ashour. He is of Egyptian descent and he was born and raised in Saudi Arabia. When he was 11 years old, his family decided to move to Canada, so he spent the majority of his upbringing in Canada before moving to Austin, Texas about 3 years ago to expand his business. So in this episode, we talk about his experience living in Saudi Arabia and also the cultural differences between the two countries when he moved to Canada. He also shares some stories about how this move impacted his family dynamics. He's a social entrepreneur, so in this episode, you hear this term a lot. We also ask him what his background is, which majority of his background was spent in school studying and getting multiple different degrees. For context, he has a degree in neuroscience and a master's degree in neuroscience, and he was actually enrolled in the McGill's MD MBA dual degree when he heard about this student challenge that would grant $1 million prize to the winning team. It's called the Holt Prize, and the challenge that Holt Prize was proposing was that they wanted to see a business plan that would eradicate food crisis. So, of course, the winning team was his team, and they had a radical idea. Their solution to this challenge was farming insects. Yeah, actual insects. So we talk in detail about where and how they even came up with this idea of farming and raising insects, and also how their company Aspire Food Group is now revolutionizing sustainable farming and healthy eating. We absolutely love their mission too, so we wanted to share the mission statement with you guys. Aspire is on a mission to celebrate, innovate, and advance responsible farming and healthy eating of insects. We know you can't wait to hear more, so without further ado, here is this week's show.
All right, Mohammed, it's really wonderful to have you join our show today. So far, you're one of the most global immigrant entrepreneurs on our show that we're getting a chance to interview. So tell us a little bit more about your home country and how long you lived there before migrating to Canada.
Yeah, of course. Home's always been a very interesting concept for me because unlike a lot of people who are sort of born and raised in a particular geography that they always kind of think back to as their ground zero, I was actually born in Saudi Arabia, even though my parents are of Egyptian descent. So to me, growing up, even though I lived in Saudi Arabia for most of the year, home was always Egypt, which is where all of my relatives, my extended family, my cousins lived. And we used to spend every summer in Egypt. And, so I never really lived in Egypt as a resident, but I've always experienced Egypt as kind of a vacation. And maybe that's why I've always had very fond memories of the culture and the people. And in the fifth grade, after completing the fifth grade, rather, my parents came up with this radical idea to move to Canada because they wanted a better future for us. I have two older siblings. So that was in 1998. So, and it's funny, my parents insist they told us we were going to be immigrating. My siblings and I insist that they didn't. They just showed up with like 12 suitcases. It was super sketchy. And we're like, yeah, it seems like more than just a summer vacation. We were getting vaccinated and all this weird stuff. Like, really, Mom, do we really need to do all of this to go to Canada? Anyway, of course, a few days later, and sure enough, Canada is home. It was, and so, yeah, we moved to Canada in the fall of, actually, this late summer of 1998. And I pretty much grew up there. I did my elementary school, high school, undergrad, graduate studies, and in fact, only moved recently to the United States about 3 years ago. But, when I think of home now, and this is true for so many people who've immigrated, you feel like you have two hearts. My love and loyalty to Canada as a country is not diminished by my love and loyalty to my people and my family in Egypt. It just feels like I have room in my heart for both, and it's impossible for me to say that only one of them feels like home. Each of them is home in its own unique way.
And when you moved to Canada as I think 10, 11-year-old boy, I assume,
Yeah.
How well did you adjust to the culture? Were there any challenges that you faced early on? Do you vividly remember any like awkward moments or anything that was, whoa, this is different. This is a completely different culture?
Completely. I mean, first of all, because I came from Saudi Arabia, so you could probably not have a more diametrically opposed culture shock. Even though technically by Saudi standards, we were actually living in a fairly liberal environment. So, in Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of compounds, which are residential gated areas for expats and other locals. So in those communities, actually, you obviously interact with your neighbors. It's not as conservative as the rest of the kingdom. So growing up, I had friends who were, of both genders. We've played with people. I mean, it was normal. It was a normal childhood. But I did go to an all-boys school until grade 5. So I show up in Canada and, here I am in a classroom where half of the people in the class are suddenly very attractive.
Right.
so that was definitely a bit of an adjustment. And a few other things too. In Saudi Arabia, you don't really have much of a public transportation system. So I didn't walk to school. There was a driver. In terms of living, having stay-at-home nannies is extremely common in the Middle East. Whereas, of course, in Canada, all of a sudden now on Sundays, I'm the toilet guy and I have to clean the bathrooms and of course I walk to school. So I think there were some immediate changes to my own life where I went from sort of being dependent on somebody to do these either simple services for me or, these kind of luxuries I took for granted, to suddenly have to actually kind of pull my weight and help out. It also, the other change for us was that for the first time, we didn't all live together as a family unit. So my father was unable to find suitable employment in Canada compared to his existing role in Saudi Arabia, which was very senior and very well established. And so rather than having to start from scratch in a foreign country, he did the more difficult task of essentially commuting back and forth between Canada and Saudi Arabia so that he can, on the one hand, afford us this life, but on the flip side, not have to compromise his own career to be able to make it possible for us to not experience a sudden, very dramatic change in our, in our living. So that was difficult because obviously it was difficult for my mother, who did not speak any English when we first moved to Canada. And, of course, she's a very independent and strong-willed woman. But at the same time, it's tough to be raising, I think at the time, my brother was maybe 14, my sister was 12, and I was 11. So those are some tough formative years where, they're about to go through puberty. There's a lot of changes, a lot of questions. Single mom, doesn't speak English. So, and my father came literally once every 2 months. I mean, I can't even imagine how many miles he flew and how much it costs to pull that off. So there were changes that were emotional, changes that were physical, changes to independence, and layer into that the fact that we were growing, into a new stage of adolescence and teenage years. So it was quite an adjustment.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point you brought on about your dad, because I think that is a very common issue with immigrant families, where they might have had a certain amount of luxuries back home, and just because they decide to move to a new country, they have to, a lot of people start from scratch, or in your case, commute back and forth to their home country for business purposes. So
absolutely. And we were lucky. I mean, I want to be clear, we weren't victims. We elected to move to Canada, which is unfortunately not true for many people. There are many people who had to flee either war or persecution or some other challenges and really, truly had to start from scratch. So, I want to be very clear that, our experience was very pleasant and romantic by comparison. So there's really no complaints here.
Yeah. And how did you guys speak in English?
Yes. So that was one of the benefits of having been to a private school in Saudi Arabia. It was actually an English school. So we spoke fluent English. When we first arrived, standard procedure, they made us go through sort of ESL testing to make sure that we
I remember those fun tests.
Yeah. We don't need any supplementary testing, and we all passed. And until today, I mean, most people, if they hear me speak, they assume I was natively born in Canada, not somebody who spent 12 years in a foreign country before coming to Canada, which usually is a time window of hanging on to accents that are tough to get rid of.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that's when you can hear my accent every now and then, because I moved at 16. I was 4 years late to that accent adjustment. But Mohammed, from your background, we can tell that you were not a good student, right?
I could have done better.
But no, you took your education pretty seriously. Did that have anything to do with having immigrant parents?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can probably all attest to this, right? You guys mentioned before we started that your backgrounds and your family's from Iran, and my family's from Egypt. Look, it's so cliche, right? The focus on you can be anything in the world as long as it's an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer, right?
Exactly.
But I think for me also, I think a special motivator, in addition to obviously having education obsessed parents. I mean, let's not forget, why did we move to Canada? For education. So if we're not doing that, then why did we have to do any of this, right? So I think there was always this sense of responsibility that, my parents have just gone through this extraordinary sacrifice, not just of their wealth, but of their own personal marriage, to be apart from each other as long as they are, sacrifice a lot on a daily basis, to accept, this assimilation and adaptation at such a late stage in their lives. I mean, when you hit your late 30s, early 40s, you're not looking to start from scratch. You're looking to plant roots, right? So for them to uproot comfort and to go to disruption and uncertainty was for a clear mission. And so to me, there was frankly a sense of guilt and responsibility. Like, I have to deliver, because if I don't make the best of this opportunity, then I just wasted, a lot of their own precious years. Years that they're not going to get back. And honestly, the best years of their lives, right? I mean, they're still youthful, they're still young at that point. And we were very comfortable in Saudi Arabia. So I think, yes, there is a cultural element, 100%. I mean, even if I had stayed hypothetically in Saudi Arabia, I'm pretty sure my parents would have still insisted that we focus on school and education. And I think the other beautiful aspect is, I think everybody, obviously, everybody who hopefully hears and listens to your show understands what it's like to be a global citizen, and the fact that there's some beauty in every culture, and there's some things that are offensive in every culture, and you take what's good and you accept the fact that certain cultures have adopted certain norms, and by their standards that's acceptable, and we just leave that. We don't have to embrace it. And to me, I think there are certain very beautiful things about Middle Eastern culture that we could honestly, adapt here in the West, and would, I think, make our societies much better off. And I think one of those aspects is this profound love and adulation of our parents. I think it's not just that, there might be a misconception that people are, like I did all the school that I did or whatever just to make my parents happy. No, I did it because I genuinely love them and I care about them. And, it goes both ways. My parents did not ever tell me, even if the conversion of Saudi riyals to Canadian dollars was getting worse and worse, and his income was becoming less and less, compelling to help us maintain that level of living. At no point did my dad say, all right, you need to go get a summer job because I can't pay your tuition, right? It just never happened. And so again, I'm very blessed that I was able to focus on my studies because my parents went out of their way to support my journey. And that's not necessarily a luxury a lot of people have. So again, I count my blessings there, and I'm grateful for it. And for the same reason, when we get older, we go out of our way to take care of our parents. So for me, I still find foreign certain concepts like, putting elders in senior homes. And I'm not saying that's you're bad if you do that. In some cases, people are actually better off in these communities, and there's studies that show that you're able to build a social life and so on. But, in our culture, it's a bit of a hard pill to swallow. I just can't imagine someone else taking care of my parents in their old age. I can't, over my dead body. That's how I think and how I'm raised, for good or for bad. And I respect those who wish to pursue other means, but this is my way.
My mom, every time I would do something that would make her angry, she would say, so what are you going to do next? You're going to put me in a senior house? Oh, why would you say that? It's that offensive. It's like the worst thing you can do.
That's funny.
And of course, looking through your background, you focused a lot in science, and that's something that Middle Eastern kids are actually very good at, science, and they're very strong in that aspect. And then after that, you go through this dual degree of MD, MBA, which is, I don't think it's that common.
Yeah, honestly, I don't think I had heard of it before we were studying your case. So
I mean JD, MBA.
Like I'm a patient.
I mean, we do our research. We're ready.
That's funny.
But tell us a little bit more about that. The degree itself. It's really interesting that you chose MD and MBA together.
Of course. I mean, and to answer that, I'll give you just one piece of quick context. So just like I said, there's good things in certain cultures and others. One beautiful thing I think in North American and Western cultures that I think we can really implement more in the Middle East is inculcating and cultivating a method of critical thinking. So when I came to Canada, the way we do science in Canada was vastly different than how I did it in the Middle East. There's just a lot of memorization. And if you're someone with a very good memory who can sit down and be focused, you're going to get good grades. But in Canada, it's not quite the same. There is some element of memorization. Yes, you have to know what an endoplasmic reticulum is, but there's application as well. There's projects you do. There's things that you build. So there's a way for you to engage with the material critically and to express your knowledge. So for me, I think it made me fall in love with science a lot more. When I sort of got to high school, that's when I really realized that there's a very obvious way to combine my three biggest passions. The first one is serving people. The second one is, doing something that's intellectually curious. And the third one is, being somebody who has an impact on society. And I found that medicine was a clear, winner to me anyway, and it spoke to the scientist in me. So after my undergrad, I did a master's degree in neuroscience, because now in Canada, there's just unfortunately degree inflation. For you to end up with a neurosurgery spot in a teaching hospital, it's not enough to have an MD and 7 years of residency. You need to have a PhD and a fellowship. It's intense. People are 43 now when they start their posts as neurosurgeons, right? I might be exaggerating a little bit, but not a lot. It's not far from that. So after my master's in neuroscience, I had about a year of gap. And by the way, I did not get into medical school the first time I applied. It's very competitive in the US. It's even more competitive, in my opinion, in Canada, because we only have 16 medical schools in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So I did not get in my first try, and that forced me to basically have to find a way to spend an extra year. So one way was to go back to research. Another way was to just say, you know what, let me go try something very different. And this brings me back nicely to my upbringing. My parents were not entrepreneurs, nor was anybody on any side of my family, except for like one uncle of my mom, something like obscure. No, entrepreneurship is just not our thing. And not only that, but I also grew up as a, I've been an observer of the world, and my passion for serving others and my love for the poor has always made me very skeptical of the way capitalism has been executed in many countries, and the way in which it creates these vast disparities in wealth between the poor and the wealthy. And so I've always felt as a proxy that business is just not really a good tool for producing impact on society. So I decided also that, you know what, I have to find a job. I don't have a luxury, to spend this year not doing something. I applied all over the place. Nobody would even give me a call or interview me, until finally I decided, you know what, I'm going to shed my pride. Even though I have a master's in neuroscience and an undergrad in neuroscience from like the top 2 universities in Canada, apparently no one cares. So I'm just going to go ahead and apply far and wide, and I'll apply to like entry-level sales positions, whatever. And finally, and I'm not exaggerating, 430 applications, I got a phone call from one startup in Waterloo, Ontario, that was like, I think at the time had, 20 employees or something like that. It was called Top Hat. It's now gone on to become one of the fastest growing startups in Canadian history. So I was a very early employee in that startup. And it was really cool. They developed a really cool classroom engagement tool that you use to basically, so instead of using those clickers in the class, it was essentially a tool that you could access on your cell phone, your laptop, to really be able to engage with the material in the classroom. So that was an eye opener for me for 2 reasons. One, it made me realize that business is not as bad as I actually thought, that it can be a tool to truly deliver impact. But also I realized that I'm not bad at this business thing myself. So I mean, the first week when I started off, I wanted to start off by working remotely as a remote salesperson. So I do virtual demos and things like that. When I showed up for my interview, the CEO said to me, look, you seem like a good guy. You seem like you're charismatic. I think you'd be good at this, but you've never done sales before, and I can't just trust you with our customers out the gate. So I'd like you to first do essentially cold calling to set up appointments for the actual salespeople. And if you do well, after a month, I could promote you. I said, okay, fine. So I moved to Waterloo for the month. I moved in with my in-laws for a month. I kept my apartment in Montreal, hoping that I would succeed and then be able to move back to work remotely. So I moved in to Waterloo, and I commuted every day. Literally, it was 2 hours to there and 2 hours back from where I was to Waterloo. And again, I had a positive attitude. Beggars can't be choosers. There's nothing shameful about work, all that kind of stuff. I showed up, I started doing these demos, and I was doing a pretty good job. And by the 3rd day on the job, I said to him, I just realized that the way the sales cycles you guys are working with, have you thought about exploring schools that are about to enter into their semester cycle? Because right now is a dead period, like Australia, for instance. He said, yeah, no, we've thought about it before, but we've never done it because the time difference, who's going to stay behind and make these calls? I said, okay, well, if I stay behind and make these calls, would you allow me to do it? He's like, yeah, absolutely. I said, okay, but there's one condition. He said, what is it? I'm like, if I set up any demos in Australia, I have to do the sale. I'm not giving it to someone else. So he said, yeah, whatever, knock yourself out, right? For him, it was no risk. It's a
good
market
negotiation tactic.
And it's a market he's not already in, so why not go for it? So I did that, and within, I think, like a couple of weeks, I closed like an entire school or something like that in New Zealand. And then, after that, the manager of the inside sales reps, that's the fancy way of saying cold caller, that manager was terminated. And so he asked me to actually be the manager of the inside sales reps. And then within 6 months, I became the VP of sales. So I actually, by the time I left, I was managing 50 people in the sales and marketing team. And that was, mind you, like within 7 months of starting, right? So that experience is what made me realize, okay, you know what? I think business can be used in such a profound way to deliver impact. And at the same time, I see huge problems in our healthcare system that can't be solved with medicine, that are structural problems in the way it is architected from a business side. And so when I went back to apply to medical school, With McGill and a few universities in Canada, there's an option to do a combined MD MBA program. So the express goal of this program is to build physicians. So ultimately, the key goal is to produce a doctor, but a doctor who understands the tools of business so that they can leverage them in clinical settings if you want to build your own clinic, or in hospital settings if you want to get into hospital administration. So potential roles could be that you could become a CEO of a hospital who spends about 3 days a week dealing with hospital administration and two days a week seeing patients. So you're still able to combine your passion for delivering clinical care while at the same time being responsible for making sure the underlying structure itself is built in a sound way. And I think that's what began to really resonate with me, the idea that impact could be done on a force multiplier basis, that I could either contribute individually to individual patients, or I could help improve an entire system that could deliver better care for thousands of patients. So I entered that program, and the second month in the program is when I got an email about the Holt Prize.
See that your transition wasn't just like, oh, go with the flow, let me see what happens. It was very strategic. It was very planned, and you had a goal. And that goal was to raise insects.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Oh, you should talk to my Egyptian parents about me dropping out of medical school to farm cricket.
Yeah, I think you should just like start a YouTube channel and just record people's reaction when you tell them what you do. I would be so interested in seeing that. That would be.
That's funny. That's so funny.
No, but seriously, tell us more. I mean, we have so many questions to ask you about what you guys do. It's fascinating. I know it because of the Holt Prize, and I've been involved in it, so I know what you do. But like, tell us about the whole journey. How did it get started? Tell us about the Holt Prize competition. Let's just dive in.
Sure. So, I mean, the Holt Prize is the world's largest student prize focused on social enterprise. So the idea is to really inspire entrepreneurs from around the world to build a business that at its very core solves a major global challenge. Every year, a new challenge is proposed, and every year $1 million prize is awarded to the winner. And the challenge is administered in a tournament style. Essentially, you have tens of thousands of companies from around the world, from hundreds of countries, applying with their ideas, and through essentially a phased process and a process of elimination, they ultimately whittle down to 5 teams or 6 teams that presents for the final winning prize of $1 million. And I came across the Holt Prize, like I said, as soon as I practically started that degree. So I started the MBA in August of 2012. In October of 2012 is when I got an email from somebody saying, "Hey, Mohammed, I know that you're into, social impact and all that tree hugging stuff. So here's this thing that I think could be interesting for you," or, something like that. So I looked at it. I was like, you know what? You know me very well. This is actually very interesting. So I looked at it, and I remember seeing Bill Clinton $1 million prize. Okay, this looks pretty impressive. But of course, and the problem was what's most compelling. It was a problem about food security. Now, again, I grew up in the Middle East, so I've eaten meat my whole life. I still do to a limited extent because I would be socially outcasted if I didn't.
Absolutely.
But in all seriousness, I've always consumed meat, and I've been too concerned about food. I've always enjoyed it. Essentially, although I didn't grow up as a foodie per se, I certainly always enjoyed food. Food was always a great way to bond with family, et cetera, et cetera. But I never really understood the impact of the food that I eat on the planet. And I think the problem of the Holt Prize brought that reality, and it's almost like it grabbed me from the collar and shook me into a new understanding and like woke me up from something I never understood, which is just the devastating impact of how we produce food currently on the planet, on one hand, and on the other hand, how that ties into so many people around the world being extremely poor and not having access to safe, affordable nutrition. So this, for whatever reason, just really resonated with me, especially given the career that I wanted to embark on, which is ostensibly to serve other people. The biggest problem I've always had with medicine, frankly, is that medicine always intervenes when it's too late. It's always after people got sick. Whereas I think one of the most compelling, things that we can focus on is how do we make sure people aren't getting sick in the first place when it can be prevented? And diet and nutrition is a very obvious one. So I put together a team from my class, people I did not know. The first two were obvious. I even though I had only known them for about a month at that point, just the few interactions I had with them made me feel like they're people I would love to work with. They're people that I respect immensely. They're very smart. They're very principled, and we have very complementary skills. So we're not just all scientists or whatever. And those were my co-founders, Gabe and Shobita, who until today are in the company. The remaining two were very impressive, colleagues. I didn't know them as much as I had known Shobita and Gabe at the time. And so the decision to bring those two on board were actually a mutual decision that Shobita, Gabe, and I made once. When we started the Halt Prize journey, the problem was so vague. It was just food security. And there's so many ways you can address this. You can address this by food production. You can address this through food distribution. You can address this through mitigating food waste. I mean, there's just so many different ways. So the reason why I wanted to put together such a diverse team is because I wanted to make sure that we don't all come from the same worldview with the same ideas. Bringing people from diverse backgrounds, diverse genders, diverse upbringings, diverse cultures increases the odds of creativity because you see the world from so many more angles than just the same one. So we came up with a lot of good ideas, but none of them were quite good enough. And good enough was actually very simple. It had to meet one simple test, and that test was, it had to be an idea we were all willing to drop out of school to pursue. So it had to be that good. And as you can appreciate, very few ideas were that good. I mean, Shobita was in law school in like her third year. I was just beginning to start med school. So it would take a lot, to have us just, Gabe was headed towards a career in management consulting. Zev was an amazing serial entrepreneur. Jesse is getting into investment banking. I mean, these are all very bright people who have great futures ahead of them in careers that they're about to walk away from. It had to be super amazing. And none of these ideas were that good. So we decided, and this was literally, I want to say maybe a month or 2 months before the regional finals of the Halt Prize. So this was now in like mid-January, that we realized we don't have any ideas still that we're like in love with. So we decided, I think it was like a Thursday afternoon, I came in and I said, you know what, guys, let's not talk to each other for a full week. And let's basically go and talk to completely random strangers and pick other people's brains. Clearly, we're lapsing into groupthink. This whole idea of us being creative and out of the box has not working. It's hit a wall. It's hit a wall. We came up with good ideas, but now we need a breakthrough. So we literally we started talking to people on the subways, people in like restaurants. It was in some cases invited and in some cases a little creepy, but we did what we had to do to talk to as many people as we could. And surprisingly, that weekend, I was invited to a good friend of mine's birthday party. But he was an actual real doctor at the time I was trying to become one. I for whatever reason, I thought it was a good idea to corner this guy in his birthday celebration in front of all his friends, to just pull him aside and start talking about food security and hunger in Africa. The amazing friend that he was, he totally indulged me. We had a really good conversation about it. And he said to me, he kind of started narrating an anecdote. He said, look, I don't really know much about, food and all of that, but and food security. But what I will say to you is something really interesting that happened in my clinic a few days ago. And basically, I had a patient that came in. She complained of abdominal pain. So I started taking her history, which of course meant that I asked her, what kind of food did you eat in the last, 48, 72 hours? And of course, one of the things she mentioned was bugs. So I looked at her and I said, no
wonder why you're feeling.
Yeah, right? Like you have abdominal pain, you ate bugs, I don't know, right? So she looked at him and she was offended. Her face turned red and she said, there's no way this is what made me feel unwell, because this is food in my country and I've been eating this since I was a kid.
And where was she from? Sorry.
She was from Cambodia.
Okay.
So then he looks at me and he said, isn't it fascinating that there's people out there who eat bugs? I said, yeah, it's definitely fascinating and gross. And I think we both just sort of dismissed it and moved on because it just seemed like such a radical idea. But then I'm driving home that night, and of course, the scientist in me kind of kicks in and realizes that that was pretty ridiculous of me, that I totally just dismissed an entire cultural practice just because I personally don't participate in it. But the very least I can do is to satisfy my curiosity and do some research on this topic. And I did, and the rest is history. I mean, I was blown away to learn that insects are food for 2 billion people, according to the United Nations FAO, in 80% of the world's countries.
Wow.
That the production of insects consumes a fraction of the amount of land, water, and energy it takes to produce any other form of livestock. And that's when we began to really understand the sheer magnitude of this problem. And I don't want to go on a tangent here, but I think it is important to at least, kind of explain how big the problem really is. I mean, today, to feed 7.5 billion people, we're using land mass equivalent to the entire continents of South America, North America, Africa, and Europe. We are using about 80% of the world's freshwater reserves. We are producing more greenhouse gas emissions from livestock production than the entire transportation sector combined. And the problem is not getting any better. We are going to have 3.5 billion more people on the planet in the next 30 years. And the UNFAO estimates that we have to produce 70% more food. We literally don't have the space, the water, the energy, the herbicides, the pesticides to produce all of this. We can't. And if we don't radically rethink how we produce food to feed this many people, we're going to be in big trouble. We used to talk in terms of how do we feed 9 billion by 2050? But more recent research suggests that it's a problem much, much sooner than 2050. As early as 2027, we will have a 214 trillion calorie deficit on this planet, which is enough food that equates to approximately 1 breakfast per person on Earth for a year. So that's a lot of food that we won't have. And so that became a big part of what made us really engaged in realizing that insects could become a massive solution to this problem, because not only can they be farmed abundantly and use a fraction of the resources to produce, but they're a superfood ingredient. They're an excellent source of protein, vitamins, other minerals and nutrients. And now, even more recently, scientific studies are being published that demonstrate the therapeutic benefits of eating insects, including their potential benefit on gut health, on reducing systemic inflammation. It's obviously early and we still have a lot more scientific data to see, but the fact is, this is a very, very compelling way to augment people's diets. And when I brought this idea back to my team the following week, of course, by then everybody had these other crazy out of the box ideas too. But this was the idea that everybody said, that's the one. I would actually drop out of school to pursue that.
I actually kind of want to go back on a point that you mentioned about how big this problem really is. It kind of took me by surprise because living in the US, or I'm sure in many Western European world countries, we don't really understand how big this issue really is. Like, I mean, I'm just shocked right now by what you said and how early this issue is going to start affecting people, as early as 2027. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that this kind of communication is not sent out? Why is this not being talked about more in the media or on the internet or through all these channels that are available to us?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of things there. I mean, first, I think there are and have been efforts to talk about this from the rooftops. I mean, there was a climate change report that just came out again that demonstrates that the problem's even more dire than it was. Whether the media chooses to publish this, that's a separate question. And, we all know there's more work the media can do to focus on issues that actually matter, as opposed to the next tweet that a particular president puts out. But in all seriousness, I think for me, there's a couple of dimensions here. First, I think that there still needs to be more education at the level of policymakers and stakeholders to truly understand the gravity of the situation. If you look back to the financial crisis in 2008, why did nobody see that coming? People literally woke up the next day and had somebody come to their house to foreclose their house. Like, it was that drastic. There was no 6-month notice. Nobody had an opportunity. Boom, overnight, you showed up to the bank and you were told to pack up your stuff and leaving. Lehman Brothers is closing and it's shutting its doors, right? And then bank after bank toppled in a domino effect from that point, and it really brought the world's economy to its knees.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it the case? Because there's an asymmetry of information between the people on the ground who see the problem and the people who are decision makers who are seeing too many problems. And it's a squeakiest wheel gets the grease situation where they tend to listen to what voters care about, not necessarily what existentially matters to the world. The fortunate thing is that there's more attention now being paid to this than ever was before. There really are a lot of even larger companies. If you look at Pepsi and you look at Nestle, these are huge legacy food companies that are going right, left, center, buying up company after company that's in the plant-based or, alternative protein-based space, because they recognize that sugary beverages are just not what's going to work in the future. So I think that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is people in general don't like to consume stuff that is this upsetting, right? Like we as human nature, we gravitate towards stuff that is uplifting, exciting, funny. So it's kind of hard to get a lot of people to put their eyeballs on an issue that's this depressing and this sad. So I think there also needs to be changes in the tactics of education that use different ways of reaching different audiences with different messages. So the way I talk about this to a policymaker might come up with a sense of urgency and a sense of, seriousness and direness. But if you talk about that to a kid, you want to be a little bit more, thoughtful about how to get that message across in a way that doesn't create hopelessness or debilitation.
We hear this a lot of times that Canada is much better when it comes to these sorts of policies or at least addressing these issues. Do you think that's actually the case?
Look, I'm a Canadian, so I'm biased, and the answer to me is a yes. But I also don't think that's just because I love Canada. I think that's based on empirical fact. Certain countries in Europe, Sweden, for example, Switzerland, Canada, these are countries that have historically always been a step ahead of everybody in terms of always auditing their sustainability, looking at ways to become better, looking at ways to get to zero waste, zero emissions, and so on and so forth. I think another aspect of it too is that, Canada and the United States were both built by immigrants. But I think Canada embraces its immigrant heritage, at least currently, under the current administration, more so than I think the United States does, at least again under this current administration. And I think that that's a massive strength for a country like Canada, because because of the diversity of the country, you're able to see a lot of perspectives and you're able to appreciate a lot of perspectives and you're able to listen to a lot of perspectives. And you're able to also mobilize those different people who all came here for the same common denominator of wanting to build a better life and a prosperous life in this country of Canada, not to necessarily bring their countries in a proxy form and transplant them within Canada. I think Canada, again, culturally speaking, is I would say a little bit more data driven in terms of its policy. Again, and I'm referring probably more to, and it changes from administration to the next. The same thing happens here. But right now, I think the Canadian government is looking very empirically at this issue and is taking some very significant and very courageous steps in the right direction to actually put their money where their mouth is. Whereas I think you see in other countries, lip service being paid to these matters without the commensurate action.
It's true. And I mean, what's going on today in the US is definitely not the best time we've had in this country.
It's extremely, extremely depressing and it's disappointing. And I mean, look, people can have their own partisan battles over specific issues, but like science is science, right? Like the planet is, there is material change that has occurred to the world's climate that is having a massive impact on its ecology, on its biodiversity, and it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And continuing to deny these facts is detrimental, not just to our friends, but to our families, to our neighbors. You asked me in the beginning of our conversation here about a saying in my own culture. I'll come to that one later. But another saying that comes to mind is, that we don't inherit this world from our parents. We borrow it from our children. And I think a lot of governments operate with a very short-term mentality of, what do I need to do to get reelected? Because there is this entitled sense of I'm an inheritor of this earth, and let me see how I can, to some degree, exploit some of it to my personal gain. And I think that attitude is a very dangerous one. And it's especially dangerous when it comes from a country that, whether we like it or not, is a world leader and is a cultural leader and is looked up to by the rest of the world in so many ways, and emulated by much of the world in many ways. So when you're a role model, whether you like it or not, it's tough love, right? You have to be on your best behavior all the time. And even if you don't like that, even if you don't like the pressure that puts on your shoulders, that's what happens when you have that much responsibility. And it's the whole saying, right? With great power comes responsibility. So I think it is, I concur 100%. It's a very difficult and dark time, I think, in the country's history, at least on issues of this kind, but many others. But again, there's efforts, right? Here we are. I'm in the United States. I'm in the heart of Texas, building a farm to raise crickets, to feed people, to address food security. And you know what? We're kicking ass.
Speaking of great people doing great stuff, we don't just invite any immigrant entrepreneurs to our show. We invite the ones that are doing great things, that are changing industries or are revolutionizing the way we do things today. And you guys are doing it in a very different way that it's pretty using crickets to feed the world. But tell us a little bit more about, I want to use this time to really educate myself and also our audience. Talk about the nutritional values of actually insects. You talked about it a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously it depends on the culture. So if you go to a place like Kumasi in Ghana, people eat insects the way you eat chicken, right? They will literally put it on a curry, and they will be used as a meat. So it will be added to a curry. It'll be grilled on a shish kebab, on a sort of thing. In the United States, what we do is we take the crickets and we mill them into a powder, and that powder is used as a supplement that is added to different foods that are already familiar to us. So we add our powder to protein bars, we add it to shakes, we add it to granola bites. It can be added to bread, it can be added to make pasta. So you can make almost any category product that exists in a supermarket and just simply substitute one ingredient for the cricket powder, which brings a lot of the nutrition to the table. So 100 grams of cricket protein powder compared to, let's say, 100-gram steak has more protein, has more iron, has more calcium, has more magnesium, and has less cholesterol, particularly the variety that is not good for you, and is an excellent source of 10 different types of vitamins and minerals, including vitamin B12, for example. And on top of all of that, like I said earlier, has provisional therapeutic effects that could either help with your gut bacteria. So every one of us obviously has their own gut biome, and our diets have an impact on how the bacteria in our gut interact with our physiology. And sometimes you can have foods that are beneficial to the bacteria in your gut to actually help your body with digestion and other metabolic activities. And there's a lot of evidence now indicating that crickets may actually have that type of a benefit on the bacteria in the gut. So it's not just that it helps you build muscles, or it improves your iron profile, or provides you with vitamins that you traditionally take from supplements, which you no longer need to take. So as an example, my co-founder, Gabe, is actually a vegetarian. But as a vegetarian, he's had to take vitamin B12 supplements for a number of years now, because his diet is in such a way that he doesn't extract much vitamins, or at least that particular vitamin, from his food. But he also eats crickets now, and he stopped taking vitamin B12 because the amount of vitamin B12 in crickets is so high that it actually meets his recommended daily intake. So it's not just, again, protein, although that's a story that is told most prevalently in the public domain. It's really a story of a very holistic superfood ingredient.
And you mentioned that in the US, are you only selling the protein or the cricket powder, or are you also selling the crickets as I don't know, do you grill them? Do you air dry them? I'm
Yeah.
not sure what the process is, so kind of shine some light on that.
Yeah, of course. So we actually earlier this year acquired a brand called Exo. It's exoprotein.com. It was actually the #1 consumer brand in the United States. They make protein bars made out of the cricket powder. So we have a number of consumer products, like protein bites, which are essentially granola clusters, except they're grainless, so they're paleo. All of our products, at least these ones, are gluten-free, they're lactose-free, and they're delicious. I mean, it's like an apple cinnamon, granola bite. You wouldn't tell that it has any other unique ingredients. The protein bars, we have like 8 different flavors, and there's 2 types, one that's high protein, high fiber, one that's more of an energy bar. But then the other thing that we also did is we launched crispy seasoned crickets.
Yeah.
So what we found is that, they're actually very, very tasty. That's the amazing thing. I mean, obviously, if you didn't know it was a cricket and you tried it, you wouldn't tell a difference. And in a country like the United States, we've seen this in our own food culture. If you went to most Americans 20 years ago and you said, by the way, in 20 years, the average American is going to be craving raw fish every week, people would say you're crazy, right? And sushi is a staple of our diet. It just is. So similarly, I think there is an element of, obviously, everybody has a certain cultural view. It doesn't help that for most of us universally, we see insects not as food, not even as pets, not even as something adorable, but as something that's squeamish or, that can destroy your crops or that can transmit diseases or can be, frightening in its own right. And so it's perfectly reasonable to understand that that's a reaction a lot of people have initially. But the species of insects that we farm is especially suited for food. So I would never tell anybody listening to this that, even if you're very inspired by this story, go and just, your backyard and pick up whatever you see there and throw it on your cookware. Because actually there's over 1 million species of insects in the world. Less than 0.1% are considered edible.
Okay.
So the instinct that a lot of people have to be a little bit uncomfortable around insects is actually perfectly sound, because 99.9% of insect species are ones you probably don't want to eat. We focus on that 0.1% of insects, and crickets in particular, that are perfectly suited for food, and we farm raise them, which means we control everything. We control the temperature, the humidity, the food, the water. There are, of course, no predators or unwanted inhabitants in our facility. We don't introduce pesticides and insecticides for obvious reasons. So there's a whole host of different things you can actually introduce. And once a consumer realizes, okay, so this is not an insect in the traditional way I think of an insect, that's in the wild that eats filth and garbage. This is on a class of its own. And that helps a lot of people overcome that psychological barrier enough to be willing to try it in powder form. Once they do, and they realize that, wow, like I was overreacting for no reason. There's really nothing here to even write home about. Then they actually become curious now and say, you know what, I actually want to taste what a cricket tastes like, not in a powder form where it's added to something else with its flavor, but I want to know what a true cricket tastes like. So to answer that question, we launched these crispy crickets, which are essentially roasted and lightly seasoned. There's 5 different seasoning. We picked chip flavors, so sriracha, sour cream and onion, barbecue. So you can pick your favorite flavor of chip. And if you eat it, it's very airy and crispy. So it's like a sunflower seed. It's super high in protein. It's very, very tasty. Every time we're at an expo or a trade show and we sample our bars, but we also sample our crispy crickets, there's long lineups of people who legitimately want to try. And once they do, they love them. They're like, I would totally eat this instead of a bag of chips, or I'd eat this watching the baseball game. And so that's actually why our crickets were sold at the Seattle Mariners baseball games last year. They're going to be sold there this year. They're going to be sold at the Atlanta Hawks, the NBA basketball team's arena. So there's really a lot of open-mindedness and people embracing this product.
I just realized that we should have probably asked you to send us some samples. So while you're talking, because the way you're talking about it, I really want to try it now. And it's morning. I'm kind of getting hungry, but now that we've talked about Aspire Group, we want to end this meeting with our signature question, which is, tell us one phrase in your native language, in your case, Arabic, that does not translate into English, and try your best to describe it to us and the listeners.
Sure. So there's so many that come to mind, but one that in particular could be relevant to this segment is لا توجد مصاعد إلى النجاح وإنما هناك درجات. Which I'm saying that in Egyptian English and not Egyptian Arabic, not in like Fusha Arabic. Fusha Arabic would be لا توجد مصاعد إلى النجاح وإنما هناك درجات. And what that means is there does not exist elevators to success, but only steps. The idea is, of course, that, success doesn't happen overnight. It's not instantaneous, and nobody's going to lift you to it. It comes in steps, it comes in sequences, and it comes slowly. And success, of course, in our culture isn't just measured in dollars, isn't just measured in wealth. It's measured in the impact that you have on those around you. And that could be as simple as being a very loving son to your father or mother, or a very, kind neighbor. There's so many ways to be successful in how we view things in Egypt, as opposed to just the typical ways we tend to measure success in the West.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this time with us. It was very lovely meeting you and having a chance to interview you and share your vision with our audience. And we really wish you all the best with this movement you're creating. And we want to see edible insect movements going to the next level, and we actually want to see it become the next sushi in the world. So we really wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun, and thanks for your kind words. And we certainly hope to be part of this huge change and impact that we wish to bring to the world.
Thank you, Mohammed.
All right, Faniz. Shirzad, take care. Have a good day.